Hello, welcome to another of the Talk Wildlife interviews. Today I'm talking to Dr. Dan Lees from BirdLife Australia. Hi Dan, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Yourself?
Good, I'm very well, thank you. Very well. Right, so we're going to be talking about a project of yours that covers beach nesting birds and some species in particular that we'll come on to in a second. You are the Coastal Birds Project Officer for BirdLife Australia and you work on this project. So I believe the project started in about 2006, is that right?
Yes, so it combined some informal monitoring efforts that were occurring across Victoria into a sort of more structured program to monitor primarily the hooded plover. Right.
Okay. And so when you set out, you mentioned the hooded plover. What were you trying to achieve when the project was put together? What drove the project for a start?
I guess in the prior decades, there was some concern, thanks to some dedicated members of the sort of environmental community that were doing regular counts of the birds, that the population was declining, slowly but steadily declining. And so that concern about the population led to BirdLife Australia sort of beginning the project in a more formal sort of structure.
Yeah, so looking at your website, we're talking about 5 waders and the fairy tern. So the 5 waders being sooty oystercatcher, pied oystercatcher, beachstone curlew, red-capped plover, and as you mentioned, the hooded plover, which is listed as vulnerable on the red list. So was it the numbers of all of those species that sort of drove the project, or was it particularly the hooded plover?
In the beginning, it was the hooded plover in particular, because unlike the other species, they're really specific about the sort of habitat requirements that they need. I mean, the others do have their specific requirements, but the hoodies, the population, especially in the southern states, was really declining notably. And that was in large part thanks to just human development and human impacts. So it started off with those. Yeah, it started off with the hooded plover, but it's grown to incorporate the other species.
So let's dwell on the hooded plover for a minute, because it's a fantastic bird for a start. So let's go down that route. So you mentioned sort of habitat. So its habitat is open beaches like other plovers, is that right?
Yes. So some of the other plovers are less picky about where they'll spend their lives, including nesting. For example, we work on the red-capped plover, and they'll happily nest and live their lives in salt marshes, bay beaches, estuaries, where ephemeral wetlands, all those sort of habitats where the hooded plover, in comparison, really only will live and breed on high energy ocean beaches, with the occasional sort of estuary, maybe low energy ocean beach. But really, I guess, at least for the eastern subspecies, primarily ocean beaches. And that also happens to be in summer when they're breeding, when humans like to pack all these ocean beaches, and then that sort of creates that conflict about sharing space between the breeding requirements of this threatened bird and human recreational use of the coastline.
Yeah, so again, you mentioned development, and then clearly now there's disturbance. So what types of, first of all, development are we talking about, and then what types of disturbance are we talking about that's having an impact on these birds?
So across, definitely, I'm not too sure about the northern parts of Australia, but across southern parts of Australia, the disturbance, the rural sort of, can I start that one again?
Yeah, sure.
So the urban expansion is really increasing at a dramatic rate, and that's meaning that more and more of the population are living closer to beaches, which puts huge pressure on the beach environment, and that leads to increases in number of people walking dogs, especially off lead, which is a huge threat to the hoodies. Just general more people on the beaches, which is more disturbance, which especially when it comes to their breeding is particularly problematic. These chicks, once their chicks hatch, they're not like some birds, they bring their food to the chicks. These birds are precocial chicks, so they are sort of like chicken chicks. They are up moving within hours of hatching, and they have to go and feed themselves. The parents still look after them in terms of protecting them and brooding them and keeping them warm, but they have to roam about the beach collecting food for themselves, and that really exposes them to potentially getting accidentally stepped on or picked off by someone's dog, or even in a lot of parts of Australia, you can drive on beaches, run over, etc. And that's prior to the project was really impacting their population. Yeah.
So, I mean, that must be incredibly difficult, because you can't say, right, okay, well, for instance, I'm assuming with something like the terns, you can fence an area off, and there's the nests, and the chicks are fed on the nests, and when they fledge, they fly out. It sounds like with hooded plovers, you can't do that because they're off as soon as they're sort of hatched, basically. So how do you do it? You know, how do you stop chicks getting stood on or picked off by dogs? What measures have you taken for that?
So it's sort of a semi-unique project in terms of we really rely heavily on volunteer citizen scientists and land managers to help us firstly fence off the nesting areas. Unlike terns, for example, where they'll nest in a colony, hooded plovers, pied oystercatchers and beach stone curlew, and although red-capped plovers can nest occasionally semi-colonially, usually they're just nesting by themselves. We'll get either the volunteers or the land managers to fence off their individual nests, and then when it comes to time for the chicks to hatch, that's when it becomes a little bit more tricky, and we really rely further on the volunteers to try and set up the fencing area to really get to know their pair and where and the pair's chicks and where they want to spend most of their time. Say, for example, you'll often have sort of spits or little rocky platforms where the birds like to spend most of their time, because that's where the best foraging resources are, and that's where you might put the fenced area in front of that really good foraging resource, so you can allow the birds to have somewhere when they're disturbed to run back to and shelter, but with also allowing the public to have a substantial portion of the beach, because we're sort of not about blocking off the beach to the public and saying no, you can't go to the beach. We're sort of trying to encourage that sharing the beach with the public. The birds can have some of their space, and then the public can have some space as well.
So how are you going about educating the public about the fact that the birds are there? And what is the public's attitude towards the birds? You know, are you finding that they sort of come along and they're sensitive to it, or, you know, or is there a mix?
There's a mix. A large portion of the public are really great about it. They're often interested. Many of them are even so interested that they sign up and become advocates or volunteers for us, which is really fantastic. As with anything in terms of conservation and even animal welfare, there's always going to be that portion of the public that aren't really receptive to your conservation message, and I guess the real challenge is trying to reach them in terms of some of our communications, whether it's signage, advertising. We often do sort of market stalls at local markets to just get our message further out there about trying to live with these birds, and about some of the behaviour change that we're looking for, to really give them, especially during their breeding season, a bit of a helping hand.
Yeah. So let's talk numbers. They're listed as vulnerable on the red list. What are their numbers like? You know, are they, how threatened are they?
So the hooded plover is sort of separated into two subspecies. So you've got, think of Australia, they in the Great Australian Bight, there's, I suppose you call it the Nullarbor, is a section of cliffs a few hundred kilometres long, and that seems to act as a fair barrier to the hoodies, who, like I said before, they're sort of sandy, high-energy ocean beach specialists. And so you've got a subspecies over in Western Australia and a subspecies in Eastern Australia. Combined, there's about 6,000 birds, we believe, in total across the two subspecies, relatively equally split between them.
Right. And are they a migratory bird?
No. So they're one of our resident species. So in the Australian or Southern Hemisphere summer, or spring and summer, from say September through till about February, that's their breeding season, and in the winter they will, depending on their territory, and this is what's really interesting, if they've got really good territory with great foraging resources, they'll stay and hold their territory over the winter, whereas if the territory is not as good, they can form overwintering flocks where they might fly up to a few hundred kilometres to just join a larger flock of hooded plovers and hang out in an estuary, for example.
Right. And so we've talked about human-driven pressures. What predators do they have, and is there any threat from sort of alien species or anything like that?
Unfortunately, they face a huge number of threats from both natural and invasive predators. The number one being the red fox, I suppose. So we found out, thanks to a lot of research with Deakin University, that their lifespan is actually quite long. So once they're an adult bird, they're actually quite a relatively long-lived species, and they seem to be a pretty plucky little bird. They don't get picked off by too much unless they're sick or injured, apart from birds of prey. But it's their breeding which is really the tricky thing, in terms of that's where they're really suffering from invasive predators, whether it's the foxes are really having a huge impact. Domestic and feral cats do have, not to the same extent as a fox, but they do have an impact. But we've even, thanks to humans being all over the beach, created super abundant native predators. So native predators that would have been at levels that could be sort of, they would have had predation rates on the hooded plover nests and chicks that would have been, I suppose you could call it sort of natural background levels of predation, are now much, much higher thanks to their larger numbers. For example, like the silver gull is a sort of comparatively small sized gull that we have in Australia, and thanks to humans and giving handouts in terms of refuse and buckets of chips and all that sort of thing, silver gulls have exploded in number. The same can be said of our ravens. And then not only have they increased massively in number, they're also spending more time at the beach, working the upper beach and the dune system where people have potentially dumped rubbish, and then they're coming across hooded plover nests and young chicks, and that's where the sort of the struggle that we're having. And they're a native predator, so of course there's we can't be baiting or controlling the native predators, or at least if we were going to go down that avenue, which we're not at this stage, it would be a lot more difficult than, say, fox control.
Yeah, right. And I've noticed, because I've just glanced at your website again, and the first frame on your video that's on your page is of what looks like two pieces of wood like this on the beach with a chick underneath it, and that's to provide shelter and shade on the beaches. So that's sort of man-made pieces of, well, almost like nesting boxes, but for want of a better phrase. Are they taken to them quite well?
Yes, there is sort of a really specific sort of circumstance that, again, Deakin, thanks to some colleagues at Deakin University, there's a sort of particular type of beach that they become really, really useful at, and that's those really wide beaches, especially at low tide when you can get, and especially in South Australia, wide beaches with very little native or very little vegetation or things to hide under. So these tiny little chicks, they start out about 10 grams when they hatch. They really rely on their camouflage and hiding up in some of the dune vegetation and seaweed, etc. So on beaches that are really sort of clean and devoid of that natural sort of hiding places, these sort of almost little huts, you could almost call them, sort of act as a bit of a sheltering spot. Because, say, on those really wide beaches, you're a little chick, you're foraging at the water's edge, which could be 50, 100 metres from the dune. If every time a vehicle sort of drove past or some people walked past, you were a little chick and you had to run all the way up to the dunes to try and get cover, those little sort of huts act as a little halfway sort of point to potentially get some shade and hide from that threat or disturbance. And after the people keep moving, for example, they can then pop out and then get back down to the water, as well as being a sheltered spot. Like a lot of these issues are sort of happening on really hot, it could be 40 degrees, could be 45 degrees down on these beaches. And if you're like I said, a 10-gram little chick and you're at the water's edge and you have to run up into the dunes, or you haven't even made it to the dunes and you're in the sun trying to pretend, on the 70-degree plus sand, you can imagine that goes pretty poorly if you have to shelter and remain in place for a length of time because of disturbance.
Yeah. So you mentioned numbers earlier on. From the start of the project to now, have you seen a change in those numbers? Would you say, the project is actually, not wanting you to undermine the project, but is the project doing well? Is it successful, or is there still work to be done? And if so, what?
There's always work to be done, but I'm really proud to say that it is a successful project from its formalized beginning, and I have nothing but, it's amazing work of the people before me to even, take their own time and volunteer and map the fact that this population was declining. Slowly that decline has stemmed over the last sort of decade, and it's now only in the past sort of 5 years that we're slowly getting a slow but noticeable increase in population, which is coming with its own challenges in terms of a slowly increasing population, and now birds are recolonizing parts of the coastline that they haven't been at in maybe a decade. So then you've got this new community of people who aren't used to this threatened bird nesting on their beach, and that's creating new challenges in terms of all of a sudden it's what they think is their beach has got this attention brought on it in terms of this nesting bird, and the struggle that is trying to get behaviour change around a community that hasn't experienced a threatened bird nesting on their beach before.
Sure. Oh, that sounds very positive. That and you're clearly proud of that. That's brilliant. So congratulations on that, and to all of the volunteers and citizen scientists that have helped you.
I've only been on the project for a couple of years now, so it's all the work of my my colleagues and the volunteers. This project is run off the back of their hard work, and I can't be more appreciative of the hard work they do in terms of finding nests, putting up the fencing, monitoring the nesting success, advocating for the birds. They really do a fantastic job.
Excellent. So I mentioned up front, 5 waded species and the fairy tern, and clearly we won't go into detail about them, on this interview. Hopefully we'll maybe do another interview in the future about them, but Do they have their own special projects, or are they almost like they're being protected as a result of what's happening with the hooded plovers?
Yeah, it's sort of the second option you mentioned. A lot of the, I guess, training we give to the volunteers and the protocols we put in place to protect the hooded plover can be broadly applied to the other species. Fairy terns are a little different in the fact that they're usually nesting on islands, for example, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those islands also don't have people living on them, and that those colonies might also need fencing and monitoring, for example. But yes, those species, although they're not the flagship species that the hoodie is, there's certainly there are groups of people, whether it's on bay beaches in Melbourne or just in other parts of South Australia, Tasmania, or even New South Wales, that have other species like hooded plovers or even beachstone curlews that the lessons we've learned over the past decade with the hooded plover and how to manage them can be applied to those species, and is having success.
Excellent. Right. Okay. Well, thank you ever so much for your time, Dan. That's a really, really good insight into what is a project that's very close to my heart, because I love a hooded plover. We'll leave it there for now. And, maybe we'll come back and talk in the future about some of these other species that you're protecting. Congratulations again on the project. It sounds like it's doing really well. And thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan. Take care.